This is a short 4-slide show to talk about this issue of characterization, which is this week's topic. I've selected some stories that raise some interesting questions about how the characters are defined, how the characters are presented, uh, and whether the characters change over time or not in the course of the story. So I thought I'd go over some of the information that's in our textbook in the back in pages 854 to 856, and then some of my own limited insights into this issue. All stories, all text, whether it's a play or a movie or a television show or a short story like we're looking at in much of this course, it's always a mixture of plot and character. You've got a setting, you've got a storyline of some sort, and you've got some kind of activity that's carried out by different characters. And of course, all this is constructed, all this is made up, all this is something that's created entirely by an author to present something to us. And our job as kind of critics of all that is to kind of look at what authors present and see what we can figure out. But there's always this mix, plot, character, and how those two things interact are the two keys here. In the old days, I mean, we're talking, Greek literature, material written a couple thousand years ago, like Oedipus, for instance. Um, in those cases, the characters are kind of fixed. They're not really all that interesting, although their actions are interesting. And so many of them are not as developed as we might like them to be. They're pretty much who they are as we meet them at the beginning of a story. Oedipus doesn't change. Um, Creon doesn't change very much as the story goes on. It's not until there's a major crisis of some sort where they make what is called a hamartia, that is an error in judgment. Sometimes you'll hear this translated as fatal flaw, and I think that's a mistake. I am no Greek scholar, but I spent a lot of time studying this idea of what exactly the Greeks meant by hamartia, and what they meant was that because of a character, some aspect of a character's personality, of their ability to make judgments, their ability to think, to react, their emotional lives, when confronted with an issue that where they can make a choice, generally speaking, they choose wrong. And so it's based on their personality, their selves at a particular moment in time being faced with something that they really don't know what to do with. And so error in judgment is really a better way to look at this. They could do something else, but they choose not to. And even though that choice is limited in some ways, it's still a choice. But again, the characters are not, they don't change very much, as I said, in the course of a play. So the characters that we see in plays like Oedipus, or shoot, I can't think of the name all of a sudden. My mind is drawing a blank. Um, those are noble characters. They're fixed characters in a sense that they don't really change very much, and the audience sees them as people in positions of power who make a mistake. Antigone, that's what I was thinking of. In Shakespeare, for instance, we move again ahead about 1,500 years, and in Shakespeare's time, suddenly character becomes much more interesting. And some of this comes from the fact that the Protestant Renaissance has happened, and that people see themselves more and more as individuals in the public eye, and that they have certain choices and options that they might not have seen themselves as having 300 or 400 or 500 years before, or certainly not in Aristotle's time, when roles in society were pretty fixed. What's interesting in Shakespeare is that not only do we see characters that are highly individuated, Hamlet is very different from Macbeth, Hamlet is different from everybody else in the court of Elsinore, um, and as a result, he really stands out. But we also find out what goes on in their heads, and they think out loud. And this is perhaps Shakespeare's great gift to us, is the soliloquy, where Hamlet comes up and tells us in the great To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, one of 7 that he has in the play, what he's thinking about, why he's considering suicide, and then why he puts it aside, why he changes his mind at the end of that speech. That's Shakespeare really is the guy who kind of reshapes the way that we look at character in literature. If we move ahead another few hundred years, we get to the 19th century, and in Europe, and in the United States, um, authors begin to look at character as highly individualized people and people who are responsible for carrying a plot, for making sure that the plot happens in a particular way. And so we get more and more insight into a character's motivations. We see more and more character development by and large, and we see how those characters influence the action. Even in a Shakespeare play, the action is kind of fixed. We know that Hamlet's going to die at the end of the play. It's a tragedy. I mean, that comes with the territory. We know that Macbeth is going to die at the end of that play because it's a real story. It's based on Scottish history. Romeo and Juliet, we kind of know from the beginning that this is going to go south. But even people in Shakespeare's audience knew that how that play was going to end before they ever saw it. Okay, it was a story that everybody knew. In the 19th century, stories start to change, and stories become more and more personal in the sense that they focus on the actions of one or two characters in a given space and time, where the outcome is in doubt because the stories are not known to the audience. It's all new. And so what you're going to see in the stories we're reading in this course, which is mostly 19th and 20th century American fiction and some 21st century American fiction, you're going to see character being the primary impeller of the story. It's not the circumstances that they're in. It's not the setting. It's not the social class. It's individual actions taken for individual reasons. The more highly individuated characters, the people who really are unique, the more unique the action is. And we'll certainly see that in other stories that we're reading. And this last point that I make here is kind of a Mike Burke rule. Genre fiction, that is the kind of thing we see on TV shows with CSI, for instance, or other kinds of standard network fare, as well as a lot of the drama that's done on Netflix or on other streaming services. The characters are less important than the action itself. They're really kind of harkening back to an earlier period where we kind of know how a cop show is going to come out. We know how a detective story is going to come out. We know how a murder mystery is going to come about. When we get into family stories, like you sometimes see on some of the cable channels, a multi-part family saga, like Game of Thrones, for instance, which is multiple families, multiple plots, multiple characters. The characters there are frankly not as well developed as they might be in some of the stories that we're going to see, because again, what the authors are doing, the guys who put those things together, is they're focusing on the action, on keeping you coming back every week. They want you to see the story. And yeah, we might identify with one character or another, but they tend to be mostly one thing or mostly another. They're good guys or they're bad guys, or they're good guys who are caught up in a set of circumstances by bad guys, or they're bad guys who have to have certain punishments happen, but maybe those punishments are delayed and they can punish other people for a while. But those kinds of stories are really driven mostly by plot. We don't spend a lot of time with the inner life of the characters. Literature that lasts, I think, is much more character driven than plot driven. And so when you get a fully developed character whose motivations, whose thinking, we understand and we can see kind of play out in front of us, that's the kind of literature that stays. I'm thinking here of one of my favorite novels, Anna Karenina, where we spend a lot of time inside Anna's head. We also spend a lot of time inside her lover Vronsky's head, where we find out what he thinks and why he acts the way that he does. And those kinds of insights we don't see very often in something even as complicated and compelling as Game of Thrones. Here's some terms that our textbook uses in the section that they devote to characterization. The idea of a protagonist, that's the hero. He's opposed or she's opposed by the antagonist. That is somebody who's the bad guy. So this is kind of that good guy, bad guy thing. And then certain kinds of characters might be a protagonist. That is, they might be the central figure of the action. But they may not be a good person. If you ever read Crime and Punishment, for instance, Raskolnikov, the major character, he's clearly the protagonist in that story, but he's a murderer, and he's not a good guy. And one of the things that we have to remember is not to confuse protagonist and good guy, antagonist and bad guy. That's the easy definition that we use, but it doesn't always work that way. The protagonist is the actor in the story, and the antagonist is the opposer of that protagonist. And this is not the only way stories are set up, obviously, but it's one of the standard ways in which stories might appear. But protagonist doesn't always mean good guy, antagonist doesn't always mean bad guy. Um, the anti-hero could very well be somebody who is outside of normal society, and he has to make choices within the context of a society of which he wants no part. We'll see that when we get to a story by Camus called The Guest later on, where the protagonist, Daru, is a school teacher who's asked to do something that is fundamentally opposed to his moral code. And as a result, he makes a decision that many of us would be surprised at. I'll just put it that way. Another way to think about characters also is in our textbook, talks about this idea of a flat character or a round character. And you can see kind of the two different forms that these characters can take. Um, a lot of stories have a very small number of flat characters. It might be a train conductor. It might be a fellow passenger on a train. It might be a secretary to a boss. You know, these are people who don't have anything direct to bring to the plot or to the action of the story, but they're there because they're needed to carry out some action of the major characters. So we don't know much about them. Okay. Round characters, on the other hand, are fully developed. These are people who have inner lives. These are people who talk about their motivations. These are people who let us into some form of understanding of what they do and why they do it and how it turns out. And so these folks may, in fact, appear in one form at the beginning of a story, and they may change over time because they have the capacity to do that, because they're fully developed human beings just like us. None of us are perfectly good. None of us are perfectly bad. All of us are a mix of these things in different proportions. And so round characters are the most human of all because they're more like what we really are. A third way that our textbook talks about characters is in static and dynamic terms. That is, a static character might not change the course of a story. They might service the plot in the sense of moving things along, but they're not going to be the people who actually shape the action or change or make a decision that's going to change the action in the course of the story. The dynamic characters do that. And our textbook talks about them in the terms of how they shape a story. I tend to think of that also as being someone who's dynamic, that is, they're capable of changing as the story goes on. They come to a realization perhaps that they've made a mistake, or they come to a realization that they've done something that worked out okay. And so those are some things to think about when you think about static and dynamic characters. As you're reading stories, look and see who stands still in terms of their development, who doesn't really change in the course of a story, and who does. This is the last slide, and this has to do with the last thing our textbook talks about, and it's certainly something that we see in all the stories that we read, and that is character development. How does a character appear to us when we first meet that character? If you think back to Why I Live at the PO, for instance, and you think about Sister, you know, we meet her and we find out only later, I mean, not immediately, but a little later, that she's the younger of two sisters in the story, and that she does, in fact, give us a physical description later of herself when she talks about how Mr. Whitaker, the photographer who ran off with her other sister, regarded her versus how she regards herself. And we get a little bit of insight into that. Okay. Sometimes we'll see a lot of physical description. Sometimes we won't. In one of the stories that we'll be reading, the 548, we get a better understanding of what Miss Dent, the secretary, looks like physically than we do of Blake, who is the main character. That's a story where I'm really not sure who the protagonist is, whether it's Dent or Blake, but when we see those two characters, you'll look at how they're described physically and note that there's a considerable difference. Something else about short stories too, about description, is that they don't have a whole lot of time. in a short story. So they're not going to describe every single thing they're wearing, for instance, or how tall they are, what color their hair is, unless it serves the purpose of either developing the character or of helping us understand some of their motivations. Okay. We might see habits in a story that a character has, and those might be more important than a physical description. Um, However, sometimes we'll see characters who are described physically for some function. I'm thinking back to the 548 again. Blake talks about what other people are wearing on the train, and that might be something to indicate what characters they are, what kinds of characters they are, at least from Blake's perspective. All those train characters, since we never see them again, are all flat characters, by the way. Okay. Something else to think about in character development is that they do develop over time psychologically, sometimes, but not all the time. Sometimes the reason they get into trouble is that they're the same person at the end of the story that they are at the beginning, and there's been no move towards redemption or recognition, or anything. They're just exactly the same. Other characters do change over time, and sometimes they get worse, and sometimes they get better in terms of their ability to, let's say, deal with issues of right or wrong, or make moral judgments, or take certain kinds of actions. And we'll certainly see that as we go through the rest of the stories of the semester. I think that dynamic characters are ones who do change. And I think it's important to recognize when they do change that we should give them some credit for that. On the other hand, there are some dynamic characters who don't change very much, who willfully say, I'm not going to do X, I'm going to do Y. And they don't change very much. And so we'll be looking at characters in that regard. Something at the end here I want to point out is this idea of motivation. Many times we have no idea why characters do what they do. And this is where a critical lens like feminism or sociology or psychology or any of those can come in, because we're trying to understand the motivations of a particular character, and the writer hasn't told us. Maybe the writer doesn't even know. When I talk to my colleagues who are fiction writers on the faculty, um, we talk a lot about character, and I said, how do you see these guys? And they said, we invent people, and then they start doing things, and we're not the guys making them do it. The character does that, him or herself. And our job is just to kind of write it down. And I know that seems very odd, because you're thinking, well, these are the guys who are creating these characters. But in fact, they create a fictional person who's based on everything they know about real people. Real people are endlessly complicated, as you guys know. So a fiction writer invents a character based on real people who are very complex. And then that character is going to kind of take on a life of his or her own, as I've said. And that character is going to take actions or think certain things. And my fiction writing colleagues tell me they don't really have a lot to do with that. They don't say, oh, no, he wouldn't think that, or no, he would think this. They just kind of say, if I had this person who was X, what would he or she do? And that's how they look at it. They don't, if they're good fiction writers, they don't tend to create characters that are just like little puppets. They create fully developed, rounded people who work just like regular human beings that have the infinite complexity that we all have. So as we read the stories for this week, I want you to start thinking about how the writers of these stories show character. What kind of physical details do they have? What kind of insights do we get from what the character says or does or thinks? Do the characters change in the course of the story? Do they go from one state to another? And if so, how does the writer tell us that? How does the writer indicate that in the course of a story? So for this week, I want you to focus on these kinds of issues, because they're the kinds of things that keep us coming back to a story. We keep coming back to Hamlet, for instance, because Hamlet himself is an enigmatic, fascinating figure. We keep coming back to Romeo and Juliet, I think because of Juliet. That's just me talking. And we keep coming back to a television series or a film because the characters interest us. And so our task for this week is to figure out, well, how do these guys do that? How does a writer convey in the short amount of space that he or she has how do they convey that to the audience? How do they make these people alive? How do they make us pretend that these people are real and we treat them as if they're actual, real, living human beings that we are watching literally in front of us act as they do?